is a Brian Wilson story called Love and Mercy. It's a story of triumph of an abused child.
映画に行きたい気分です。楽しみにしています。
If you know anything about Bing Crosby, the crooner from the 50s and 60s, a little bit into the 70s, he was an egotistical maniac who abused and beat the hell out of his children. And the Wilson brothers from the Beach Boys, they went through the exact same thing with their own father, living in his household. In fact, it got to the point where the father was so abusive, they fired him as their music manager. In Brian Wilson's case, his father used to beat him so bad with his clenched fists, like this, that Brian lost 98% of the hearing in one of his ears, and it produced such trauma and brain disorder that Brian began, in 1963, Brian began to hear voices and become paranoid and develop a mental disorder, which later was not diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia. It was just the result of the abuse he took. His other brothers seemed to fare better, but Brian seemed to get it the worst. Brian was the musical genius in the Beach Boys. He's the one that wrote the songs, put it all together, and with the help of another, and the help of the other wasn't as important as Brian's, but the Beach Boys couldn't have been what they were without Brian Wilson, since he wrote the song and put the music together. And his psychosis got so bad, as the movie indicates, that he began to take the music that used to play in his head, and he would form. He began to interject the psychosis into the music, so that in the background of the music you could hear faint voices talking, or noises, or animals barking, or whatever he could get in. He was imitating what he was going through in the music, and it almost got him kicked out of the Beach Boys, because his older brother just didn't approve at all. His life developed for Brian in this movie. I'm talking about this movie part. He got depressed, more depressed as the years went by. He was married, he had a daughter. And eventually he just went to bed, and he stayed there, in bed, literally in bed, for nearly 3 years. Until the family intervened, they decided to get him a psychiatrist. They picked the wrong man. The psychiatrist was a similar being to what his father was. His father, by the way, I should mention, his father sold off the Beach Boys' rights for $750,000 to their own music. It's just a major tragedy having that idiot as a father. But the psychiatrist was a replacement for the father, so that, yeah, he got Brian out of bed almost after 3 years of being in bed. He was a really portly, heavy guy, just on the verge of death. But the psychiatrist was a psychopath, and he constantly bullied Brian into doing what he wanted, and he eventually took over Brian's life, putting him into a guest house, and the psychiatrist took over Brian's beach house, and just literally just bleeding Brian dry like a leech would. And then I guess the psychiatrist came up with the idea that he was going to kill Brian off, so he got Brian to rearrange his own will so that everything would go to the psychiatrist. Fortunately, there was a maid who was also Brian had a maid who was being abused by the psychiatrist. Fortunately, the maid found a will that the psychiatrist had, a copy of it. She kept it, maybe in terms of wanting to save him, but where she was a Mexican illegal immigrant, she was limited what she could do for Brian. Brian eventually wanted to buy a Cadillac, and that's how he met this woman, who was later to be instrumental in saving his life. Because Brian fell in love with her, the psychiatrist wanted to dominate this woman as well and keep her at bay and keep her under control, which he couldn't do. So the psychiatrist forbid the woman to ever see Brian, and she broke Brian and this woman up, the car sales lady from the Cadillac franchise, because he could not control her. And as time passed, the maid was taking Brian's medication. The psychiatrist was trying to kill Brian through medication, completely obliterate his mind and whatever. But the maid was confiscating some of the pills, which she kept in a jar, huge jar full of pills. So eventually, Brian tried to meet the sales lady again, bring her back into his life because he was in love with her. And the sales lady came to see Brian again, and then the maid decided to make her move and intervene to save Brian's life. And she presented the pills, and she presented the will, and that's when the car sales lady decided she'd better intervene, because this guy, this psychotic psychiatrist, is going to kill Brian. She intervened, she contacted Brian Wilson's family, and because of the heroic effort of this illegal immigrant from Mexico, Brian Wilson is alive today, still writing music. That's the value of an illegal immigrant working in this family. She saved Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys' life. And it's just a story of a triumph of an abused child, and Brian's doing okay right now. And even though the psychiatrist had diagnosed Brian as paranoid schizophrenic and was giving him medications he should never have had, never took, because it turned him into a vegetable. The psychiatrist ended up losing his fortune with Brian and ended up being dismissed from psychiatry. He was kicked out, not allowed to practice medicine in the United States, and lost everything. And Brian's almost completely recovered from his psychosis, and there's a great victory at the end. You feel really good about watching this movie. And it shocks the hell out of you, because you don't expect to see what you're seeing. You knew Brian had problems dealing with reality, but you have no idea how bad that was until you see this movie, and you get to see the real Brian Wilson at the end of this movie singing a victory song. I completely recommend you go watch this movie. This is everything. It's like a love story, a story of victory, a story of hope, story of triumph over real adversary and real evil. The Brian Wilson story, love and mercy. You gotta see this film. This is magnificent. Probably, I would say maybe the second best film of the year for me.